Hello, everybody. A very good afternoon. I hope you're back from lunch and fully caffeinated. I'm screaming at the top of my lungs because I've been told I need to project my voice because that's our microphone right now. So welcome to the panel, Partitions and Race Making. We are very excited to have with us all the speakers in person and the discussant online. So it's very exciting that, we will hear from everybody here and then we can quiz them over reception, etc. So the first speaker is my dear colleague, Ollie Charbonneau, who is joining us from history at the University of Glasgow. Ollie is lecturer in American history. Their current research focuses on the co-constitution of US settler and overseas empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Their first book, Civilizational Imperatives, America's Moros and the Colonial World, was published by Cornell in 2020. And its Philippine edition was shortlisted, congratulations, for a Philippine National Book Award. Their writing has appeared in Diplomatic History, Modern American History, and the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. In 2022, they were awarded the Stuart Burnett Lecture Prize from Schaefer for their contributions to the field. Congratulations, Ollie. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do all the introductions together, and then I'm going to sit somewhere there. So after Ollie, we will hear from Professor Jonathan Saha. He's professor of history at the University of Durham, researching colonial Myanmar. His first book, Law, Disorder, and the Colonial State, was published by Palgrave in 2013. And his most recent book is Colonizing Animals, Interspecies Empire in Myanmar, published in 2022 by Cambridge. And he's published in various important places like Past and Present, AHR, on a range of other topics such as law, mental illness, crime, and masculinity. And then we shall turn to Professor Michael Charney, who is joining us from SOAS. He is a military historian of Asia who has spent his career at the Center for Advanced Studies, NUS, National University of Singapore, Tokyo, and other places. He's based in SOAS, University of London. He teaches at CISD, so Center for International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS and the Department of History. His main research interests are history of military logistics, armies and warfare, modern and contemporary Asia, historical culture of war in Southeast Asia, West Africa, an emergence of religious and national cultures in Myanmar and the Greater Bay of Bengal. And it's the last part which brings him to the panel. So welcome, everybody. We will be joining from India by my dear friend and colleague, Debjani Bhattacharyya, who is up there. Debjani holds the chair for history of the Anthropocene at the University of Zurich. She was an associate professor of history and urban studies at Drexel in Pennsylvania before this. Her first book, Empire and Ecology, my apologies, in the Bengal Delta, The Making of Calcutta, won the 2019 honorable mention for the best book award in urban history. And currently she's writing a long history on climate futures in the Indian Ocean world. So without further ado, Ollie, the floor is yours.
Okay. So slides, yeah. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Jay, thanks so much for inviting me and indeed for organizing this as well. This is really wonderful. So I'm going to talk today about something that was remaindered basically from my first project, and that I didn't know what to do with it, and so it didn't make it into the book. But I've since come back to it after a recent archival trip to Manila last year. And it has to do with petition writing. Indeed, as per the theme of this conference, partitions as well. Just a heads up, the lecture does deal with colonial violence, and there is one slide to that effect. So, oh. There we go. Am I controlling it or no?
Yeah, you're
okay. All right, cool. So what you see here are two primary source documents. One is an Associated Press article that was republished in the Manila Bulletin in 1932. And the other is a petition from Haji Abdullah Maranao Moro leader in Marawi to President Franklin D. Roosevelt from May 1934. And both, in their own ways, deal with this sentiment that you could find in the southern Philippines in the early 1930s amongst Muslim Moro populations that was arguing against decolonization or independence. In the case of the first, it's a petition signed by more than 2,000 Moro leaders arguing that independence should not happen or should be drastically elongated. We're about to come into the Commonwealth period in the last 10 years of American rule, which is interrupted by Japanese colonial empire, and then proceeds to independence in 1946. And in the other, a direct petition to the US president asking for this not to happen. And this reminded me of a question that my friend Jojo Abinalis, who's at the University of Hawaii, works in Philippine studies, had asked me a long time ago. And that was, why is it that if you go to Mindanao today, Moro impressions of the US colonial period are often ambivalent and once in a while positive? This was a difficult question, I think, and one that sort of I struggled with during my time in Mindanao as well, given that there's this sort of disconnect between some of these impressions and what those of us who study the period see as its extreme violence, and certainly it wasn't something that I wanted to kind of grapple with in the book. But I'll come back to it now. So how do we explain this? And what do documents like petitions requesting the permanent partition of Muslim Mindanao and Sulu, or at minimum the long-term extension of US colonialism, tell us about colonial state-making in the interwar period? Indeed, how are different forms of partition imagined by the colonized as solutions to paradigms of decolonization that will disadvantage them? We go. So I've given enough talks on this subject to know that some context is required, and I can't just assume that everybody's familiar with the southern Philippines. So this is a map of the area that I'm talking about here, specifically Western Mindanao and the Sulu Archipelago, which is an island chain stretching from Mindanao out towards Borneo. And this is an area that undergoes very little colonization during the long Spanish colonial period in the Philippines. In some areas, almost none, and it's really not until the late 19th century in places like Jolo that we see a greater Spanish colonial foothold. So when the United States arrives following the War of 1898, they're moving into very different territory than the Christianized north of the Philippines. And the conquest of the South is something that happens separate from the Philippine-American War, which more of you might be familiar with, which happens between 1898 and 1902. So in 1903, the South is set up as what's known as the Moro province, and this is a partitioned within the Philippines sub-state run by the US Army for over a decade. This is, in effect, an acknowledgement that Mindanao and Sulu are spaces distinct from the old centers of Spanish colonial rule emanating from Manila, but it's also wrapped up in US race-making as well, which ranked Moros lower on the civilizational ladder than Christian Filipinos, and thus believed that they required more tutelage. So part of my earlier book details this period, which stretches from the end of the 19th century really up until the Second World War, and its violence, right? This is a time marked by repeated massacres. Those of you on Twitter probably have seen Kim Wagner's latest project on the Budaho massacre. This is where it takes place in Sulu. Dislocation and the erosion of customary structures of authority in Moro communities. There is elite collaboration, the same sort that we find in most colonies during this period, but American-Moro relations, indeed this is part of the thesis of the book, are on the whole not at all harmonious. After the military leaves in 1914, it's replaced by a militarized police force known as the Philippine Constabulary, as well as Christian Filipino administrators. But this doesn't change much. Moros are still detained and killed with impunity. We still see livestock destruction, village burnings, and so forth. And this is a dynamic that continues through the 1920s at a time when Americans and Manila-based Filipino elites are wrangling over what independence for the Philippines might look like, with the South being folded into what's known as the Moro problem. So late 19th, early 20th century historians are probably familiar with encountering everything being a problem or a question. The Moro problem is imagined as this issue of how to integrate resistant Muslim populations into a nascent Philippine national identity. Eventually, independence does come, although it's gradated with the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934, and this grants the Philippines gradual independence. And there's a decade of Commonwealth status that's followed by formal decolonization. So we come back to the partitions once again. It's during this road to independence, slow road to independence in the 1920s and 30s, that we see the frenzy of Moro partition writing, encouraging the Americans to permanently partition the Southern Philippines and keep it. Now, this sort of territorial imagination, for these Moro groups, if they can't claim independence for themselves, they could at least be kept within the orbit of the United States. And reaching out to the US at this time, I mean, it's not as kind of outlandish as it seems today. We're not many decades removed from the annexation of Hawaii, of Guam, of Samoa. Indeed, claiming Mindanao is something that could have potentially happened in a sort of different history. So what causes this shift? The shift from this antagonistic relationship between American military and civilian colonial administrators and these Moro groups that leaves tens of thousands dead at minimum during the first 3 decades of American rule, to one where escaping the yoke of US colonial rule is not at the top of the agenda. The answer comes from something that has received, I would argue, only marginal attention in US and Philippine historiographies, and that is settler colonialism within the Philippines and its relationship with US overseas empire. This began decades earlier with the reinvention of Mindanao as a settler colonial utopia, an Edenic space of endless agricultural and mineralogical wealth. And it's a narrative that will be adopted in the first decades of the 20th century by 3 distinct waves of settlers. The first wave are Americans. They are the creators of the Mindanao narrative, and they argue for its permanent partition and annexation to the United States. So this is in the first decade and a half of the 20th century. And these are people, primarily men, single men, a lot of them ex-soldiers, who come to the Southern Philippines inspired by the conquest of the American West, indeed, oftentimes directly speaking about it and using it as a reference point, as well as the settler colonial annexation of Hawaii. They do things like found hemp plantations, timber companies, have nascent mining operations, but for a variety of reasons, which include labor shortages, and the Chinese Exclusion Act, which extends to the Philippines, is implicated in this, and various government obstructions. So in the settlers' view, not extending land reforms quick enough. This is a wave that's going to fizzle out, really by about 1915, by the end of the military period. Americans get frustrated and they go home, and this is sort of the end of the white man's country in Mindanao, as they called it. More importantly, though, this is going to give rise to a second and third wave of settlers to Mindanao. The first that I'm not going to speak that much about today are Japanese settlers. At one point, Mindanao is the largest Japanese diasporic population in Asia, largely hemp farmers who are located in the southeast of the island in an area called Davao, which some of you might have encountered in the news. It's where Rodrigo Duterte is from. And the third wave are Filipino peasants who are largely coming from overcrowded areas in Luzon, the large northern island of the Philippines, and the Visayas, which is the central island group. And this third group is going to receive a good amount of support from Manila. So after the Philippinization of the colonial state begins in the mid-1910s, there are a host of programs that are going to encourage settlers to move south to exploit the supposedly empty lands of Mindanao. And by the 1930s, with independence looming, this is going to accelerate. Mindanao becomes sort of key in the government imaginary to unlocking the full potential of an independent Philippines. It's both an economic engine and a demographic steam valve. So I thought a lot about this when I was in Manila last year, looking through books that were published in and around the city during this time, many of which were by boosters who were writing about, basically writing how-to guides about how to settle Mindanao in the south, right? They had titles like Glimpses of Mindanao, The Land of Promise, and my other work, which touches on U.S. settler colonialism in the Western territories. They were incredibly familiar, right? They sort of broke down everything you needed to know about packing up and leaving for the frontier, except in this case, it was the southern islands of the Philippines rather than Dakota territory. Which brings us back once more to these petitions. They emerge from what I've just described, the fact that U.S. empire becomes a vehicle for Filipino settler colonialism and part of a larger push to constitute homogeneous nationhood out of an incredible ethno-linguistic heterogeneity. So what does this mean for the Moros? In effect, it means minoritization, both on a national scale as a political entity within a newly nationalized Philippines. Gotcha. And also, if settlement proceeds within their own homelands as well, they have to kind of imagine a future as Muslim Filipinos, which is a term that gets applied to them in the early 20th century, sometimes anachronistically at points where it shouldn't be. So there are two bad options. There's an American status quo, which limits to a degree settler ingress. And then there's the other one where the Philippine state is mobilizing economically and demographically to conquer the southern islands, and in which the United States no longer appears to be the same type of threat that it was before, or at least it can protect this from proceeding as rapidly as it might, which is how we end up with this strange set of petitions requesting partition, right? The belief that one form of colonialism will not be as catastrophic as another, the violence of colonial order making as less threatening than the erasures of minoritized existence. Of course, for any of you who are familiar with the contemporary Philippines, these petitions fail. This is an instance where partition does not happen, but in the subsequent decades, it's an unresolved issue, and the government tries to dampen raging separatist violence by extending degrees of autonomy to the Muslim regions of the South. I think it's worth sort of pointing out as a very quick footnote that these petition writers were right to sort of fear what would happen. Between 1948 and the 1960s, they're demographically displaced and minoritized in their own homelands by the largest migratory wave to the tune of about 2 million people in the history of the Philippine archipelago. And this permanently changes the southern islands, with ramifications that continue to this day. So Haji Abdullah, one of the petition writers who was from Marawi, Marawi in 2017 was razed to the ground by the Philippine Army as a part of these kind of broader independence struggles that have been going on really for, since the Spanish period. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Am I good to go? No, evidently. So I was intrigued to have been invited to speak at this conference, in part because until recently, Myanmar has not been a place much associated with processes of partition. This may be the legacy of a tendency to study the country as a more or less stable and discrete unit of analysis. Where the language of partition has begun to be used as a framing device to understand the processes through which British Burma was separated from British India on the way to becoming an independent nation state between 1930 and 1948, it has been part of the long partition of India that has been traced from the separation of Myanmar through to the establishment of Bangladesh. In this sense, British Burma's secession from India has retrospectively acquired the framing of a partition. And even there, it has been framed as something of a precursor to the partitioning of Bengal and Pakistan. And Punjab, sorry. This conference then, by focusing on the Treaty of Lausanne, enables us to locate the separation in a wider and longer history of territorial divisions becoming the norm for solving problems of protracted political violence. In my paper, I'm going to focus on a couple of instances of communal violence that broke out in Myanmar during the Hsaya rebellion, a vast peasant insurrection that spread across half the districts of the colony between December 1930 and 1932, resulting in the capture of over 8,000 insurgents and the deaths of approximately 3,000. The two cases that I look at are different. In the first, a small band of guerrilla fighters murder a group of Indian cattle herders. In the second, a larger body of rebels lay siege to a Chin village. The cases are not representative of the rebellion as a whole, which was attended by communal violence, but was not dominated by it. They do, however, reveal the dynamics of the rebellion as they played out in the district of Prome in late 1931. Prome is located in the center of Myanmar, between the Chin Hills to the west and the Pegu Yoma Mountains to the east, and bisected by the Irrawaddy River. It has historically been an interface between the drier northern climes of the country and the Deltic south, and was at the frontier of an earlier age of partitioning, that of colonial occupations during the 19th century, when the ruling Compound dynasty's southern territory was ceded to the East India Company. And as an aside, writing this paper has prompted me to think more about the relationship between the partitioning of colonization alongside the partitioning of decolonization, something that Professor Sluger's paper spoke to this morning. Prome was at the heart of much of the rebellion and witnessed some of the most infamous acts of counterinsurgency violence as the colonial state desperately sought to suppress the revolt, including a mass decapitation at the village of Weto, a place just tens of miles from the sites of the two cases I discuss in this paper. This context is important for understanding the timing of the communal violence, which became more marked once the revolt moved to the more attritional conflict of guerrilla warfare, much of which was waged in the ecotones where the mountains met the plains. The rebellion was largely on the back foot by this time, and combatants had become hardened to the brutalities of the clash with the Indian Army. The reason for focusing on these two instances of communal violence is to make 2 points about the creeping, intertwined processes of racialization and territorialization in Myanmar during the 1930s that partition was posited as a solution to. The first is that subaltern understandings of these processes are not necessarily congruent with those circulating in the high political sphere. The second is that subaltern violence, even when it took a markedly communal form, was ambiguous. Taking seriously that peasants' reasons for engaging in communal violence were hard to interpret at the time and remain so today, helps us counter any lingering telos that would hold that popular intercommunal animosity was a driving force for the partition of British Burma from British India. There was nothing determinate in this violence. Instead, the violence reveals the incomplete separation of communities, racial differences that were unclear, and communal geographies that were non-contiguous. I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit now, but try to stay with me. And if you don't worry. In many senses, the medium is the message. This is kind of messy. Peasant insurgents are discerning in who they attack. But this discriminatory identification of enemies was quite clearly at work in my first case, what I'm going to refer to as the Inbintla massacre. It was one of a spate of recorded attacks on Indians in rural Myanmar during 1931 that had resulted in the deaths of 65 people by August. Nevertheless, it is difficult to be certain whether these 6 men were murdered because they were Indian and cattle herders, or whether targeting cattle herders was simply a strategy for getting to Indians who had a preponderance in that particular line of work. In other words, it is unclear whether grievances over cattle ownership were material to the massacre. There is some contextual evidence to support this latter interpretation. This was not the only occasion during the revolt that Indian cattle herders had been singled out for attacks. The cost of cattle had increased throughout the early 20th century, and ownership showed signs of becoming concentrated in fewer hands. Settlement reports from the Delta noted a growing racial aspect to this, with Indians being most likely to own more than one yoke, although they were just as likely to own no yokes, owing to the class divisions within the communities. Additionally, Indian-owned cattle were blamed by imperial officials and local cultivators for spreading disease and instigating crossbreeding, believed to lower the quality of indigenous Burmese stock. But the cattle herders killed in the Inbintla massacre were not owners of cattle. They were hired by slaughterhouse owners, dealers and breeders from the nearby market town of Poundé, and their assailants would probably have been aware of this. The incident itself occurred the day after the weekly cattle market held in Durham town. Prospective buyers travelled there with herders by train on the morning of the market. Once they'd purchased their cattle, they travelled back on train, and the herders took the cattle back via road. Poundé was also where 2 prominent rebel bands had formed and were operated, the Lion Army and the Tiger Army. And it was a regional centre for cattle ownership, a temporary home to animals who were resold or leased to peasants or butchered for meat. As a result, the day after the cattle market, the road to Poundé was routinely used by cattle herders. The decision to target this road on this day indicates forethought and planning, rather than a spontaneous act of opportunism. The 3 rebels involved in this case, Liu Ji, Aung Chain, his brother On Nhan, one of the leaders of the Lion Army, waited by the side of a road for the cattle herders to come to them. They arrived in 2 groups. The first party of cattle herders was Mia Maung, Abdul Saman, and Basan Mia, who led 10 bullocks and 2 buffalo, and they were confronted by On Nhan, who was armed with a gun. Abdul Saman and Basan Mia, both of whom were described in the legal records as Indian, was separated from Mia Maung, who was Bama. Liu Ji and Aung Chain took the 2 Indian men away and murdered them. After being threatened by On Nhan, Mia Maung managed to escape when the second party arrived, and the second group was larger. It had 10 men and 25 buffalo. On Nhan stopped them under the pretense of inspecting their cattle purchases. He then threatened one of the cattle herders called Ishmael, a man who was identified in the documents as Zabadi, which is a term used at the time to identify Burmese Muslims. Ishmael was compelled to tie up the 4 cattle herders who were identified as Indian: Hati, Abdul Satur, Haider Ali, and Onthu. Ishmael and the remaining cattle herders were then released on the condition that they did not speak of the event. Onyu, Liu Ji, and Aung Chain then took their captives to a site a furlong further than the shallow grave containing the bodies of the first 2 Indian cattle herders and murdered them. The legal records refer to the victims as Indian throughout, although there was some recognition of sub-national ethnic differences in the documentation. Hati was described as Oriya and Abdul Satur as Chittagonian, a problematic terminology, as we now know, but I can come into that in questions if people want to probe that. All the dead were identified by family members from fragments of clothing and what could be discerned from their bodily remains. This suggests at least some rootedness in the area, particularly as two were identified by their wives. State statistics suggest that temporary migrants were mostly single men at this time, whose stay in the country lasted for less than a year. But two differentiations were apparent in the murders that colonial categorizations of the murdered men as Indian glosses over. The first was the decision not to kill Ishmael. So Zabadi Muslims were a community whose leaders in the 1930s were calling for greater recognition of their indigeneity in a climate of growing Islamophobic violence in Rangoon. Given the Buddhist elements to the revolt, Ishmael may have been a potential target for the Lion Army. The second was the decision to kill On Thu, whose name might have been Burmese, although the imprecision of colonial-era transcription makes it impossible to say for sure. He was identified by his wife, Ma Mei Yin, from his shirt, coat, and Burmese-style sarong, or longji. Her name is unmistakably Burmese. These glimpses into the victims' wider social lives are insufficient to reconstruct how they might have self-identified, but they do show that the ascription of Indian to in some of the legal records obscured Myanmar's religious and racial complexity and fluidity. Set in the context of the time, the argument that the massacre was one of racialized violence remains a compelling interpretation, but a central question remains. What was the basis of the rebels' ascription of racial difference? Was their attire read as foreign? In the case of On Thu, probably not. Was it language or accent that were heard of as indicators of foreignness? Or more crudely, a reading of their physical phenotypic differences that distinguished some set of cattle herders from others? These questions cannot be answered satisfactorily, but despite this, the discriminatory imperative of insurgents' violence, there is an intrinsic degree of arbitrariness to racialized violence. In asking these questions, I'm underscoring my contention that people's lived experiences in colonial Myanmar did not always conform to prevailing racial categorizations. Even if On Thu was killed for being Indian, this does not mean that that was how he saw himself. My second case is that of an attack on Jojia village. Inadvertently, this one reveals the geographic aspects of ethnic tensions at work in the revolt. This attack was led by one Sang Kun, a leader of a similar raid on a Chin village a few weeks prior. Like that confrontation, Sang Kun headed out to the village with a small band of rebels, which grew en route, reaching 22 by the time they arrived. It's not stated in this case whether they arrived with music and bearing arms, as it was recorded they did in the previous attack, but when they arrived and entered Jojia village, most of the villagers had already fled, except for the unfortunate people, Ma Shui Pu, who had been left in her home with her children and a baby, as well as a young boy called Maung Hlo and a 17-year-old woman, Ma Chin Mei. Sang Kun discovered Ma Shui Pu and her family and Maung Hlo and then ordered the village to be vacated. Ma Chin Mei was taken from the village by an advanced group of rebels as they left. I hope you're keeping up with some of this. Don't worry too much. As Ma Shui Pu was taken from her home holding her infant, she was followed by her distraught 6-year-old daughter. This child was slashed at with a knife by a rebel, apparently under the orders of Sang Kun, who was irritated by the child's cries. This child sadly died immediately. Meanwhile, Ma Chin Mei had been released by the first group of rebels, and when she ran back to her home, she was cut down by a knife wielded by Sang Kun, although she survived. Sang Kun, with 2 other rebels, then attempted to ransom Ma Shui Pu back to the village, with the poor lad Maung Hlo going as the go-between. The exchange was largely unsuccessful. Apparently, Sang Kun only received 38 rupees, having demanded 1,000. But nevertheless, the remaining captives were returned alive before the rebels left. The gendering of this violence, with the targeting of women and girls, suggests itself a role of ethnic antagonism in this case. However, it was the misinformation about the perpetrators of this attack provided by some of the inhabitants of Georgia that revealed the communal tensions at work. In the initial report made by some of the villagers of Georgia, it was not Sankun or any members of his rebel group who were identified as the culprits, but members of a group led by a man called Chet Su that witnesses came forward to claim to have seen. It was only after Sankun was arrested that these witness statements were all withdrawn. In the trial, these false statements were deemed immaterial to the case, which rested instead on the evidence of approvers and confessions. The false statements of the Chin villagers, however, opened the records to some self-reflection on the social context for the generation of evidence on rebel crimes. Judge H.F. Dunkley, who presided over the special court in Prome, sought to explain the false statements. One cannot have tried as many of these rebel cases as I have without being struck by the intense hatred which existed during the rebellion between Chins and Burmans. Chins were killed on sight by rebels, and Chins were ready to denounce any Burman of the crime committed by rebels against them. End of his quote. For Dunkley, a wider context of ethnic tension was informing both the revolt and the state's attempts to bring rebels to justice. This claim, however, was itself generalizing and rested on imperial assumptions about the fixed nature of ethnic groupings in the colony. But it can be contextualized within the contingencies of this moment in the revolt and read against the ambiguities of the case. And there are ambiguities in the trial records as to whether Chin villages were viewed by rebels as being outside the domain of the rebellion. Last couple of paragraphs. While the records on the Georgia case is silent on the rationale for the attacks, the earlier raid, led by Sankun on a nearby Chin village, was to realize affiliation fees for a rebel association. The contrast with the Inbin La massacre is instructive. In that case, Indian individuals or perceived Indian individuals were separated from multi-ethnic groups and killed without any attempt to forcibly enlist them or to extort them under the guise of support. Evidently, there was a clearer alignment in the imagination of ethnic and physical space when it came to the exclusion of those thought to be Indian foreigners than there was with Chin populations. The differentiation of Burma and Chin populations in the revolt, or perhaps because of the revolt, appears to have been something of a threshold for this racialization. They shared the same physical space. This isn't near the Chin Hills, this is on the opposite side of Prome district that this is happening. They shared the same physical space that made up the domain of the revolt, but their ethnic proximity was marked by ambivalence, in spite of similar class interests. These are all peasant cultivators. In the eyes of the rebels, the villages of Georgia could have been, even should have been, comrades in arms. Because they weren't, they became enemies. The early 1930s in Myanmar were dominated by ferocious debates over whether the colony should be separated, the term that was used at the time instead of partition, from India. The episodes of popular intercommunal violence that occurred around this time were both fodder in these discussions and a source of material concern for minority communities. But, as the cases I have discussed today show, there was a disconnection between these debates over constitutional arrangements and the lived experiences of subaltern groups. At this level, who constituted an Indian was not fixed or necessarily self-evident. And ethnicity and territory did not map neatly onto one another. I would tentatively conclude then, but in the Hsaya rebellion at least, communal division did not precede popular violence as much as it was one of its contingent effects. Thanks.
Now, I've submitted a written paper, which you all have, and evidently there's a Discussant. So I'm going to give some additional thoughts instead of just reading over that paper. Just so we can. Okay, so first, I gave a talk in Canberra a few weeks ago at the Burma Update Conference, and I talked about Black American soldiers in World War II in Burma. And not a lot of people really talk about them, particularly not people in the UK, in Asian studies in the UK, and certainly not a lot of American scholars of Burma studies. And I argued that we hear a lot about soldiers in Africa and Burma because our Burma studies in the UK sits in an area of studies whose origins are in the imperial period. And so our Burma is always looked at in the context of India, while the American Burma sits in a Cold War context in the US. And so Burma is never considered within the context of India. And this is really dramatically the case. If you go to American Studies, Area Studies Conference in the US, or at least when I was in the United States, only in the context of the rest of Southeast Asia proper. And as a result, Burma studies scholars do not have a lot to say about the tens of thousands of Black Americans who worked and fought in Burma, but we have no shortage of books on the experiences of African soldiers from West Africa in Burma during the war. On the other hand, wearing my historian hat, I find it much more useful to think of Burma regarding some topics in the context of West Africa because of the nature of state building, the low population to land ratio, and the impact of warfare of firearms, as well as the lateness of colonial rule. This question regarding the closeness of India and Burma is relevant because we're sitting in the UK for this, and several of us are talking about partition in the overall context of empire. Even though Lausanne is about Greece and Turkey, some of us start thinking about India and Burma, like Jonathan's paper just now. Jonathan has asked regarding some of the topics he's published on, why some Burma developments in the colonial period have not been considered more as India-wide developments, which is an entirely appropriate question to ask. Although historians of India have treated Burma evidence, such as the place of women, there are scholars of colonial India whose entirely evidence that comes from Burma records as colonial Indian case studies. Some topics have not been included, such as he's been talking about Hsaya. Partition is relevant here because part of the reason is likely that this rebellion is seen in the context of the partitioning off of Burma in 1937 as one reason for it, and so not relevant to the broader politics of India. On the other hand, the partitioning of Burma in 1937 gets forgotten on the Indian end, although this is very arguably an earlier part of the larger partitioning of India as a whole that gets revisited in 1947. It's pretty clear that the two partitions are interrelated. And their impact has not just produced similar results and problems in India and Burma and Bangladesh, and in some areas, such as the stretch of Zomia, Southeast Asia's Highland Massif, where Burma, India, and Bangladesh intersect, they have compounded problems for the same population groups. And I'm personally coming to this topic from the experience of having worked for a long time on an ethnic group who got caught up in the partitions, the Rohingya. What I have tried to get across in the written version of the paper is that they get locked geographically in the earlier partition of 1937 into the new Buddhist entity that gets carved out of India, Burma, along with some but not all of the non-Buddhist highland groups in the area. As a result, the Rohingya, who really should have been part of Bangladesh or East Pakistan, and some fight to do it in the early 1950s, are locked out, and a choice was made by the British, who still controlled all of India at the end of the war and had more military clout in Burma than ever before. They stick with the results of the earlier partition, and they don't revisit Burma as well as the rest of India in 1947, as they probably should have done. This made sense, perhaps, in the politics of pre-war Burma, but would have been far better, arguably, for the ethnic minority areas in the Zomia area to have been kept together, either independently in some sort of federation or together within India or within Burma, but not cut between, making them strong enough to force a federal constitution in the case of Burma. And it's clear that the partitions of 1937 and 1947 belong to the post-Lausanne era. Prior to this, there are a huge number of changes, incremental changes, territorial reconfigurations in India made on the basis of administrative convenience. And this was particularly so in the case of Burma. We can argue whether the new Burma was really the old Burma. I don't believe it was. Pre-colonial Burma was taken apart piece by piece and tossed around to Bengal and the Strait settlements. And then some places were reassembled, not all of them. And that's the Burma we have today. And I've considered the earlier iterations of the colony. I believe that the pre-Lausanne divisions were made for, again, administrative convenience and not for reasons having anything to do with race, religion, or ethnicity of the population. But from 1923, they certainly are, at least in the case of Burma. In Burma, it was not the later partitions, but the earlier pre-1923 divisions that had the greatest impact on producing new ethnicities. The Chin, the Zo, Lushai, and other groups are partly the result of who sat on which side of the internal borders of British India. From 1923, we do not see groups being redivided in the same way. The processes of ethnicity formation already reached critical mass in the late 19th century, so that those on multiple sides of the border after that, the Kachin or the Wa, for example, were durable enough to resist change due to political boundary reconfigurations. Now, some will argue that the Rohingya emerged after the 1937 partition, or even the 1947 partition, in response to being detached from Bangladesh in order to secure their home in Rakhine, the western province of Burma, as a political invention. And I spent a number of years now arguing against this view and the rejection the school makes of evidence for the emergence of this ethnicity earlier on, and the presence of the people who fall within it and within Burma prior to 1824. The other side of the question is why partition was experienced differently in both 1937 and 1947 relative to the 1923 Lausanne evidence. Why was that so thorough and accompanied on both sides immediately with state pressures to make the demographic reality match the legal bifurcation of peoples in Greece and Turkey? Why is it that the Rohingya are still in Burma after 1937 and even then after 1947? Why does it take so long to the late 1970s, 1990s, and 2010s for the violence in Burma to emerge against the anomalies left after partitions, whereas they were so immediate in Greece and Turkey? And my initial explanation that I mapped out here in the paper, and obviously I'm going to think some more about this, but multiple factors will be involved. But I think the kinds of constitutions in place were much more liberal in the commitment to their tenets, more protected in India and Burma than they were in Turkey and Greece. Yes, Turkey had a secular modernist constitution, but not so much political commitment to it when it came to non-Muslims in the 1920s and 1930s, whereas ethnic minorities had a lot of protection and inclusion in India and Burma for a few decades after the promulgation of their own independence constitutions. So why did the negative impacts on populations in respect to the territorial results of partition emerge at all? It's very easy to sweep the problems under Modi and the 2012-2017 attacks on the Rohingya to the global, the trend we've seen everywhere in more recent times, empowered by social media in response to globalization and the rise of popular nativist localism everywhere. However, this would ignore the many steps up until this point in India and Burma, especially in Burma, to challenge, replace, or circumvent the constitutional protections through the evolution of certain intellectual tools. In the case of Burma, this was Nick Cheeseman's idea of the Dang Tha myth, which we can think of in two ways. First, in my paper, I suggest it provided the Dang Tha myth suggests that you have two different groups of people, and one group are these 135 ethnic groups who are all indigenous, even if they're not the Burman majority, and the other group are Indians, Chinese, and Muslims who came in after 1823, so from 1824 in British rule, and hence are colonial and not indigenous. So first in my paper, I suggest that it provided an intellectual mechanism for depriving the Rohingya of their indigeneity and identifying acceptable groups as native sons of the soil. I did not suggest this in the formal paper, but add this now because I was thinking of this when Professor Sluga's talk during that talk and the discussion there of African case studies reminding me of the argument that we are about that we hear about partition's impact in Africa what we hear about is that if you want to reach communities, we forget national state boundaries and you think in terms of tribal groups. The second way we can look at the Dang Tha myth is a return away from the liberal democratic constitutionalism of the 1950s in Burma back towards pre-colonial notions of political authority. In this case, political power was drawn through and exerted over people and not through territorial sovereignty. The related and less discussed development accompanying the myth is that just as the Rohingya Indians Chinese were told they did not belong, tribal groups of Changfa and Tangfa, river people and hill people who were living in Bangladesh were told that they did, at least informally, through their being believed to be extensions of their kind, even though none had in any generation lived within the territorial boundaries of the Myanmar state. In this view, renewed by the military in the 1960s and after, the territorial partitions of 1937 and 47 were being made more flexible in the context of longer-term indigenous political culture. Now, the wall I mentioned in my paper, if you read my paper, when I visited the camps, we also took a tour, and it was really interesting because they had this huge barbed wire fence wall, and the Myanmar soldiers were looking down as we were there. And there's part of Burma actually that sticks out, and a lot of Rohingya refugees are on there outside the wall. So the wall isn't entirely to protect Burma's borders, but it's to keep Rohingya from coming back in. So the wall I mentioned in my paper was not there as a sacred monument to the territorial delineation of the state, but simply as a physical block to the transgressions of the border by unwanted population groups, that no man's land I just mentioned. We come back to Professor Sluga's talk and some of the discussion after it. It raises the question of the different ways in partition that the different ways partition was understood or not understood in different societies, as well as which levels these get recognized and accepted. While accepted in the Western legal sense by the state in Myanmar in 1948, it clearly did not shape understandings at some levels at the popular level, and these interests reached national political power in 1962 with the military takeover. From this interpretation, the assault on the Rohingya was the final realization of the intentions of the 1947 partition. To push the population, these groups identified as Bangladeshis, back into Bangladesh, but brings us back to the more recent emphasis on thinking that groups that belong together need to be on the right side of the border. On the other hand, the underlying message is this more recent phase of violence is that these problems are colonial in origin, and that this pushback against populations that remain on the wrong side of the border is that this is the final step in resolving the legacies of colonialism. That these partitions were imposed at a time of an imbalance in power, with the British exerting the agency, as was the case in some of the colonial era border relationships, as Dr. Yachuri commented about in her talk. Now, that's all I'm going to add to this. You have my written paper, and there will be a discussant now that's going to, okay, I'll leave it to that. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm really, really sorry that I can't be there in person. And but I want to thank Jayita Sarkar for inviting me, and I want to thank all the panelists for this very rich set of papers. I am not a scholar of partition. I'm much more of an environmental historian, but that is actually quite exciting because I drew a lot from what each of you presented. So I have the difficult task of thinking through this paper as I sit here in Kolkata and constantly read about what is currently happening in Manipur and very similar kinds of ethnic violence, and really like it's almost this like people sitting in India trying to understand what has been happening in Manipur and quite not coping with it. So it's also been very interesting to read the news and these three papers, like read Professor Charney's paper and listen to both your talks, quite productive. So I have the difficult task of pulling these papers together and then raising a set of questions. So these are my rough notes as I was listening. So I think in some ways, the one concern kind of threads these three papers, and it is very much how partition emerged or almost emerged in the case of Charbonneau's paper as what to do with population that had been branded resistant and within this moment of the early 20th century. I'm going to use early 20th century or the end of empire moment, what to do with the population. And this may be Rakhine, this may be the Moro, this may be quote unquote Indian in the case of Saha's paper, and what to do with it. And this raises one of the things that I kept thinking as I was listening to it, what made these populations resistant in the first place. And there we actually have different histories. In some cases, it may be histories of people coming in from outside. It may be histories of, I think, settler colonialism is a concept that was used by Charbonneau. But it may just be of how are these populations becoming resistant was a question that I kept thinking about. Were they always resistant, or was it that in the early 20th century, in the moment of the end of empire, some populations are getting marked out as resistant? And perhaps with it, I kept thinking of another concept much more widely, and this came out as I was listening to the first paper, is especially because they began with the petition. I kept thinking of some of the petitions of the princely states within South Asia actually gave to the colonial empire, to the crown, demanding that they continue to remain, especially thinking of Travancore, remain under the British Empire, even as the British were going. And what I really liked is with the Moro case, what you showed was it's a very different, a subaltern population and not the princely population, that raises a whole host of questions that we within South Asia have made arguments about indirect rule, about slippery sovereignty of these kinds of princely enclaves. So there is that question that came to my head as I was listening. So one of the thread I kept thinking about the term that ran through all the papers is this resistant population and the inclusion, or what to do with the resistant population. This links up to the second thread that ran through all the three papers, and that came out also strongly in both Saha's paper and Charney's paper, are these kind of, what is the territory, which is a very Zomia-like territory in Charney's paper, but also a territory, and I think Saha, you used the term ecotone in your case. And these Zomia-like territory then raises a set of questions for all of us to think about, is how is the question of territory, and what is it that we mean when we say territory in each of these cases. So I think when we think of the Montanao, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, these are mineralogically rich spaces and very fertile spaces we are thinking of. In Saha's case, of course, it is an ecotone. In the case of Charney, it's defined as the Zomia, and the term Zomia has been used to understand this place within the scholarship. But how do we understand territorialization and the minoritization or racialization if we think these three papers together? What does it allow us to think about territorialization largely in the case of partition? It comes from the question that I think got sort of raised during the panel, is why is it that when we think in terms of including these resistant population, a territorial response comes to mind, and the territorial response being partition comes to mind? Why is that often? Were there any other kind of alternatives available at that time? And today, sitting here, we might think that is the only thing, but I was kind of curious if there were other options available that didn't have to have a territorial kind of an end. Then the third thing that came, like that ran through all the papers, and I kept thinking a little bit about, was the way all the panelists used the question, or like kind of pushed against the idea of identity and tried to think about the fluidity of identities. And there was the economic identity, and I think it came across closely when I read Charney's paper. Like there were economic solutions that had economic rationality during one set of partition, and then the religio-ethnic identity or social identities became kind of important. At a second partition, I think it was very strongly when you spoke about cattle traders, Saha, that the question of economic identity versus the Indian quote-unquote identity, and I have a question about the cattle traders. And then finally, also in the Moro identity, it feels much more defined as a very much ethnic identity, but it seems that the space of mineralogical and fertile richness might also raise certain set of questions about economic identity. So I thought maybe y'all can reflect a little bit about how this economic identity of the people or the professions and the socio-ethnic religious identity is being used. And then the question that generally I had is, if it might be possible also to think a little bit about the landscape and the space of the particular spaces we are talking about. We have used broadly in the titles Philippines and Burma, But when I read the papers or listened to the papers, I felt there were very particular environmental spaces that were being spoken about. And we also used throughout the things terms like hill people, river people. So I was wondering if there is what would an environmental framework to thinking about some of these questions of partitions, how would they be important? And I asked this question not simply because I'm an environmental historian, but I attended another conference that Jayita Sarkar had done, which was on homelands. And one of the things I was thinking is, homeland and questions of these kinds of environmental natural resources are often coming tied together during this place. It was not just language and ethnicity. So I was wondering if there was a way to connect questions of homeland, questions of the environmental framing of the space with these kinds of, with our understanding of these kinds of many partitions we are talking about. And then for very, very specific questions, I will have 3 questions for each of the panelists. So I'll begin with Charbonneau. And I think I mentioned it very briefly. When I was listening to your paper, I kept thinking about, you begin with the Moro population is a very, very particular kind of population. But these kinds of petitions for the British to remain or to remain under imperial power has a longer history within South Asia. And I kept wondering, your petitions actually sheds a completely new light on the questions of these kinds of semi-sovereign spaces, and if Mindanao might be considered one of these kind of semi-sovereign spaces, and how do we think about this petition a little more expansively from within the South and Southeast Asia literature, not just going to straight to the settler colonialism literature, if you may have thoughts about that. Jonathan, I could not help but think about, Gyan Pandey's essay, Rallying Around the Cow. And, cattle herders and cattle breeders at this point have a very, very particular history in South Asia. And and I like the fact that you continue to use the term Indian and then put pressure on it. You don't immediately go, they may be Muslims or they may be something. But I kept wondering, how do we understand the anger against this particular profession of the cattle herders, apart from the fact that cattle was becoming more expensive? How do we understand that, given what is playing out in the Indian subcontinent at the moment? Because of the Gaurakshas are on the rise, the cow protections, cow vigilantism is on the rise, and there is also this whole kind of, there are these cow lynchings have already begun in the Indian subcontinent. I was thinking through that. And finally, coming to Charney's paper, a question I had is, tell me if I misread the paper, is I kept thinking, you said that, what would have happened if the partitions did not follow the social identities, but thought through some sort of a economic rationale? How would that look like in some way, or the distinction between if we didn't think of economic rationale, thought through some of the social identities? So my question is, how do we unpack the question of is it even possible to unpack these 2 things? Or do we need to really, really think through this together? Think about community, not just as social ethnic identities, but social ethnic identities that are embedded within these kind of political economic organizations. I hope they made sense. Thank you so much.
I don't know if you're fine with coming here and answering the question.
Yeah, I mean,
the microphone.
Yeah, for sure. Wow, that's a lot to think about. Thank you for such productive comments. I guess a couple of things that stood out that you were asking about. I mean, in terms of the question of semi-sovereignty and Moro history, I mean, in a sense, these plans for partition, when faced, when faced with the option of kind of a large Western empire, or this sort of incoming post-colonial nation state, partition, to these groups that are sort of demographically and economically and militarily marginalized, is the only kind of way that they can see, as far as my understanding of it, of kind of reinscribing any form of sovereignty or reinscribing the idea that Mindanao and Sulu are a space that are distinct from the rest of the Philippines and shouldn't necessarily just kind of be swallowed up within the Philippines, not as an archipelago, but as a nation state. Because really, as I was saying at the outset of the talk, up until the mid-19th century, we're talking about spaces that are governed largely by dynamic sultanates that are very much embedded in the sort of political and economic life of island Southeast Asia. So in a sense, what you're seeing in the 20s and 30s, after 30 years of American incursion and the erosion of these sort of the datuship, basically the customary structures of rule, is a kind of attempt to ward off what is seen as kind of even kind of greater threat to these groups that are collectively identified as Moro. In terms of sort of the environmental question, or environmentally how Mindanao is imagined. I mean, Mindanao is cast, like many settler colonial spaces, as a waste space, that sort of at the same time is incredibly wealthy, but it's wasted because it's not being used. It's not being used to be populated by people. It's not being used for the growing colonial plantation complex that we're seeing in Asia and Africa during this period. It's not being used to be mined, and therefore, something, by the logic of kind of the modern state, something needs to be done about it. So that's how kind of the state, the Philippine state and the American colonial state as well, imagine this place and how Mindanao becomes this settler colonial site. And then finally, just on kind of the issue of more broadly Moro identity, I think, that was something that I would have had to double my time talking about, but Moro, for those of you familiar with Spanish history, I mean, Moro is a designation that comes from the Reconquista and is laminated onto Southeast Asia, onto this really diverse set of Islamicized groups in Mindanao, Palawan, and the Sulu archipelago. And then eventually is kind of reclaimed by them and used today as a means of solidarity against this larger sort of homogenous nation state. Yeah, I'll leave it there because I don't want to sort of dominate time.
You want to go? Yeah, sure. You're something.
Okay. So on the question of cattle and wider understandings of cattle in the time, there is a cow protection movement which is going on in Myanmar. It doesn't have the same, well, amongst Buddhists, it doesn't have the same force or organization as what it has in parts of India, but it is there. But of course, the symbolic meaning of oxen, even within its economic uses, is very strong. So narratives about indebtedness often focus on the emotional loss of cattle, not just their economic worth, which is being lost. It's kind of similar to land. It represents the loss of potential. It represents the loss of being able to socially reproduce and all the sort of broader meanings that are attached to that. But I'd like to pick up on your point about the environmental histories of this, because I think it speaks to the what's the right word, the provocation, if you like, from Professor Sluga at the start to think about the planetary in terms of partitions. And I've been thinking through that sort of in the back of my mind a little bit as we've been talking. And I think in the case which I'm looking at of a peasant revolt, there are at least two ways in which the topography or physical environment or non-human agents are operating here. And it's no coincidence that the spaces in which the Hsaya rebellion is playing out in the late 1931 are the same spaces where the current revolts in Myanmar are also playing out. It's in those zones where you can move out of the forest into the plains, into villages, back into the forest. You're using the landscape. It provides a set of options and abilities for actors to be able to do things. But it's a space that is not congruent with the imagined spaces of liberation that are trying to be built. So there's a tension there that is produced in effect partly by the resources of the topography, Now that gets me thinking a little bit about what I think might be a useful dynamic in Ranajit Guha's elementary aspects of peasant insurgency that could be lifted for its purpose there to think more about political violence more broadly and how it might play into partitions and the failures of partitions. So he argues one of the things that gives peasant rebellions their dynamism is that there's an imagined ethnic territory, an imagined domain that should be the place of the peasant rebels that doesn't match or fit on to the reality of the arrangement of the place in which they actually reside in. And the tension between those two things is what gives the peasant rebellion its urgency to spread from its immediate locales and bring in other places. It also gives it its regional limits, which is what Guha is mostly interested in. But if we were to lift that and think that as a dynamic for other things, was an incongruency between the imagined or desired space and the realities of a space which can actually be claimed, then maybe we're getting into something there about why partitions might emerge, not just as a solution from above, but as something that may have purchase with communities in below. I don't know, it's literally something I've thought about in the last 10 minutes. So, but yeah, those are my thoughts. So thank you for those comments, Debjani, they're really helpful.
Yeah, I'll only respond to two things. First of all, I've read exactly what I said about the 1940, it being better if the British included if the British had revisited partition. I forget exactly what the point I was making, other than the earlier ones didn't work out so well in the long run for the Rohingya. So the fact is the Rohingya are living in 1 million people living in refugee camps on the Bangladeshi side of the border, and Bangladesh doesn't want them, and Burma doesn't want them back. And I guess it's a philosophical question: is it better off that they're like that, or in some kind of historical situation where they would be included? If they had been territorially included in 1947 with East Pakistan, they'd be part of Bangladesh today. So they'd be much better off. The other comment I make is that as I was doing the paper and as I was doing my comments on the paper, I'm a pre-modernist originally by training, and actually it became, I thought about what if I'd done a different paper, and I think the one I would have done, I'm happy with the paper I did, but an even more attractive paper I think would be to look at an intellectual history of how different highland groups and the Rohingya thought about territoriality. How do you get people like the Burmese and others who have always thought about power in terms of controlling people and not land? How do you even get them to think about partition? And that seems to be an even more attractive topic than the one I picked. So sometimes you look back and you wish there's grass is always green on the other side, but it just seems to me that maybe that's a direction to pick up on now. So thank you. Those were like, what?
I'd read that paper.
Yeah. Oh, you won't read my other one?
No, I will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes or so for questions and, reception before, so we can linger if you have more questions. So we're doing great advice. So I was told projecting. That's right. Most of us teach, so we can do that. Laura.
I have a question for all three of these. They're wonderful panelists, and this is really great, really fascinating from a number of different directions. But I was struck that despite the title of this workshop, that I think, Michael, that your paper was the first mention of Lausanne. And I am wondering whether all three of you could comment on its relevance for your particular case studies, or perhaps its irrelevance, in which case we need a different explanation for why these concepts of partition all arise in such disparate spaces and such disparate local conditions, right? Around the same kind of basic time period. And maybe I might extend this question to think about, whether not only is Lausanne itself relevant here to these case studies in such disparate, regions, but also whether the kind of late Ottoman history of, separatism and exchange and so forth, even prior to Lausanne, is relevant here. I was struck particularly with your paper, Jonathan, your final comment about communal violence producing identity rather than the other way around, which is something that late Ottomanists have been saying about the Balkan Wars, for instance, for a very long time, right? So I'm just curious whether are these comparative, frameworks relevant here? Do they matter? Does Lausanne, is there a memory of Lausanne or a kind of reference point for it in the Philippines or in South Asia? What is happening here that, is this something that comes up for any of you?
Time-wise, it does. I think I tried to make the point that before this time, when you have these types of reconfigurations territorially within British India, they didn't consider religion, that kind of thing, but they do after that. The other thing for me, the reason I thought about doing this in terms of the Rohingya is that, and what would happen to the Rohingya if they had been included, is that, as I understand, a lot of the Greeks who lived in Turkey refer to themselves actually as Romans until relatively late, and they don't get absorbed into, so they're not really Greek until they get absorbed after the Treaty of Lausanne. A lot of communities are still thinking themselves as Roman, and then they get absorbed and they die. That's as far as I know, because I'm not a Greek specialist. So
yeah, I mean, the word Rum it's a more general reference.
Okay, but we have them being absorbed into. I'm sure today these communities would not think of themselves still as that. They would think of themselves as Greek, and that's why I think maybe if the Rohingya had been absorbed into Bangladesh, they'd be Bangladeshi today, and there would be no problems.
So I think for the separation of Burma from the rest of British India, it's possibly not particularly relevant because there's an assumption. I mean, it is in terms of how it divides up communities that live between the two places, but the assumption is that Burma is discrete and separate from India, and that precedes separation. And the debate about separation, whether it's to stay as part of Burma and it's not to stay, whether to stay part of India or not, for Burmese nationalists is less about whether Myanmar is a separate place and more about what is the best way of getting accelerated pace to independence. And the problems of political violence or communal violence against Indians kind of emerges alongside the discussions of separation rather than being a big pressure to push it. In fact, some arguments are that it's deliberately manipulated by ethno-nationalist Burmese politicians who organize themselves much in the same way as Ali Raza's paper was describing them, who deliberately provoke anti-Indian violence, particularly in the later 1930s, in order to push a particular agenda, a particular version of independent Myanmar in that constitutional context. So I don't see reference to it, not that I've looked at it, but in the petitions you get around the Simon Commission in 1928 onward to 1930s, I'm not seeing references to it from the Burmese petitioners or the delegates there. I think the assumption is that it has a distinctive, already has a distinctive constitutional place and represents a different place. I think that isn't actually true when you look at what's happening in the border, but there's a sort of accepted level of difference there, of separation, which is already imagined.
But to add to this, even before that, culturally, Burma had always seen itself as part of the larger India. So India was, the subcontinent was great, was Mazima Desa, so Middle Earth. And their kings had all come from India, were part of these migrating kings came out of India. They were connected to the Buddha this way, and the big center for the Buddhist Holy Land of pilgrimage is Bodh. So that's in India too. So that it's an interesting question of how they saw themselves as part of India, but then how we wound up at the place where they divide.
Yeah, I guess it's who are we voicing as well in that. Yeah. And so the articulations of it are from particular I guess middle level politics you might get, and that's what we mostly are getting at, I guess, when people are talking about these histories. But there'll be other resonances at different levels.
So I've not seen direct reference to Lausanne by moral petition writers during this period. That's not to say that they're not kind of integrated into this global slipstream of of discourse that's kind of running through the Islamic world. They're involved in Hajj mobilities, even if only some of them make it to Singapore. They're aware of obviously what's going on in the world. And then in terms of the Ottoman Empire, I mean, a few decades before this, you see, for instance, a lot of datus and sultans in Maranao, in the Lanao region, invoking the protection of the Ottoman Empire when the American military is trying to conquer them, saying that like this is our sort of framework of protection, and if you attack us, then the Sultan of Constantinople is going to come down on top of you, which of course is not true, but is sort of part of this broader kind of global Ummah imaginary that they see themselves as part of. In terms of where their ideas of kind of partition and sort of more broadly sovereignty come from, I mean, I think part of this has to do with the fact that parts of all of Sulu and parts of Mindanao within living memory have been sovereign spaces, not under the control of a colonial power. And we can't say that for Luzon or the Visayas, where there's been hundreds of years of Spanish rule, even if it's kind of fractured in some spaces. And so, in a sense, it's kind of protecting or reconstituting, what was once there, even if, say, the Sultan of Sulu doesn't actually have any real political authority. Can still sort of nominally be there, whereas within the Philippine nation state that potentially looks different.
Yeah, I'd like to push a little bit more on Debjani's question about space, because I think it's a very interesting one in terms of partition and decolonization, and maybe you have said things about it, but I'm really interested in how you think the image of space was changing over time during this sort of period. And so for the Moro, for example, I would like to know more how you think the Moro movement, or whatever you want to say, changed its ideas about space as it became clearer that it would be part of the Philippines, independent Philippines. And for the other two papers, about the Indo-Burma borderlands, perhaps, I think that's also a very interesting question. In some areas, it's clearer than for others, but as partition drew nearer, there was lots of activity going on, lobbying, petitions, and so on. And of course, it's on the critical event of partition and stories, some of them apocryphal, about hoisting the wrong flag, right? So in the beginning, the Indian flag went up. In the southern, the Burmese flag went up, and they both were allotted to Pakistan. And the Rohingyas had the Pakistani flag, and so those became big things about space and how people think about it. But there was many other sort of areas where this was going on. Now, Jonathan, when you talk about your very interesting case, I was thinking, what about Chin conceptions of space? And can you read anything from your sources to tell us more about that? And similarly, about the Rohingya, was there ever, you think, a moment when they thought they were part of Greater Chittagong, in the sense of what we now know as Chittagong, or was there a sense of being a sort of Bengali speakers in Arakan? I mean, how did the Rohingya space contract or expand? I hope you can tell me something about that.
Is it for you? Oh, for me. Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Should we take it in order or reverse?
Reverse.
Okay.
I just went.
Yeah, no, my own idea is that the way I perceive it is that Chittagong and Rakhine have always been a whole, and we've had a historical circulation of people. So we talk about Muslims and Buddhists, but actually, and even Hindus, but there's a lot of intermarriage. If you actually look at Rohingya families, it intersects all the way. And I think a lot of this has to do with economic connections and so on, commercial connections. But historically, just because northern Rakhine, Chittagong fell under Muslim Bengal, and then it under the Mughals, and then it separated for a while under the British, and then it gets reconnected. It doesn't mean that people's perceptions of those areas change. And I would imagine that to go back to the situation of Greeks living in Turkey, it was probably a lot of that going on, but we don't have a lot of evidence to work on. We just have to suppose that that was the case. The one of the things I draw out from that is that we just shouldn't ask that question about Chittagong and the Muslims, because when the British reinvaded in 1824, a lot of the Rakhine elite, the Buddhist elite who emerged, were all families and officials who lived in the northern part who saw themselves as part of Rakhine at the time. So certainly some people, we have evidence of some people, and these happen to be the Buddhists, who saw the whole thing as Rakhine. And there's no reason to suppose the Muslims, just because they're Muslim, would have seen themselves as different.
The Chin perceptions of space is a really great question. I don't think I've got a good answer to it. Most of the research which I've been trying to borrow and lean on for this works on Chins living in the Chin hills and not Chin populations or Chin villages dispersed across the sort of plains of Myanmar. And where I dug in to try and find stuff, there's some stuff on sort of the proximity and loan words between Chin and Bama languages and the closeness of language groups, the performance of Chin identity in post-war Chin villages, and the extent to which isolation increases a sort of visibility of ethnic difference in a way that is less prominent in the hills themselves. Those are some things which have been indicated there. But I do have a series of questions that comes out of what I looked at that I think are maybe interesting and things to think about. And that's internal migrations and movements. When there's types of violence and processes of Burmanization happening, do Chin villages and Chin people move back to the hills? Well, that wouldn't be back, it would be moving to the hills. Do the process of assimilation become stronger in that time period? Like all of those types of things I think would be really interesting to explore. And they're not necessarily being looked at in the same intensity as the anti-Indian violence, partly because it didn't result in the same scale of movement with people and human misery, but there's still real important tensions to explore there. And my sort of working hypothesis would be that the spatiality becomes a bit like Mandy Sedan describes in Being and Becoming Kachin, sort of in some ways more bounded to the hills, but perpetuated through the circularity of people moving into spaces where they're minoritized more prominently and bringing that stronger sense of ethnic identity back to the hills. But that's a supposition based on the Kachin experience.
Yeah, I mean, space is a really complicated question. I mean, arguably before 1903, when the U.S. colonial authorities homogenized these parts of Muslim Mindanao and Sulu into the Moro province, people there don't understand them as just kind of one large Moro space. They understand them as these sort of distinct ethno-linguistic spaces, polycultural, lots of them, dominated by, say, Tausug or Maguindanao, but in the case of mainland Mindanao, also populated by upland indigenous peoples as well, and in competition and collaboration with one another. And what the Moro province does is it in a sense, forces these groups, the Muslim groups particularly, to mobilize their own homogenization against first the colonial state and then later the national state, right? To develop more of a collective identity and to understand their spaces more capaciously and in more connected ways than maybe they previously would have, because they've been forced to. That's not to say that these groups still don't compete with one another in various ways, but the sort of reclamation of the term Moro and the idea of these broader Moro spaces is something that's really forced into being in the 20th century, much in the way as we see kind of similar tactics emerge from the Native American boarding schools in the United States, right? Where this process of homogenization in some ways kind of gives birth to this, cross-ethnic solidarities between different indigenous peoples.
My question is specifically for Michael, because you mentioned it in the paper, but the rest of the I look forward to hearing that. You repeatedly mentioned or talked about 1947 as a point when potentially 1937 and the drawing border making of 1947 could be undone, but it isn't undone, and the consequences are
Or redone.
Yeah, well, exactly. But I wanted to probe you a bit further on why it wasn't and couldn't be undone. Is there something about the making of that border in 1937, which then makes it difficult to undo in 1927? Or is it just simply colonial oversight or not thinking about it? Does that have to do with pre-colonial geographies and political state formations? Or so is it purely not thinking?
Well, what happened and the cause for that, so it locked in place areas of Burma that kept encapsulated populations that might have been better off in terms of their safety from the view of today, retroactively, with other entities that emerged. And it wasn't possible after you cut Burma out and a lot of these different populations to Burma unless you revisited that partition, then they would be stuck outside of this. And so there are other configurations that might have been better off for different highland peoples, but certainly for the Ringa in Western Burma who get stuck there. Now, why they cut things the way they did, a lot of it was responding to pressure from the Burmese who wanted independence for Burma, which they saw as a complete entity, but the complete entity they were talking about was not the real pre-colonial entity. It's something the British had created out of, it's a geographical fiction, right? That's not the old Burma. If they got in the old Burma, they would have gotten Assam and Manipur and all these other places too. But the provincial outline, the territorial outline that they had, that's what they got as an independent state. That's why the British want to kind of like, in a lot of ways, it parallels, not to take the Russian side, but it parallels a lot of the gripes that Putin has about some of the states that emerged out of Russia because they left the Soviet Union at a particular time and took away territory that Russian nationalists might see as actually Russian. Now, that not to parallel, I wouldn't suggest that the same solution should be followed in Burma, but that's what the issue is. You lock places in time with how things looked right at that time, but they appear completely wrong later. The problem was an opportunity was missed in 1947. Actually, to revisit that, to even think about that. Should we withdraw the boundaries of Burma? Should something from India be included in Burma? Are there parts of Burma such as we have lowland Burma, parliamentary Burma, you have the frontier areas, maybe the frontier areas, some of which want to remain in the Commonwealth, might be better off if they remain part of a as the Hindus defined it, the non-Muslim India, that was the parliamentary India that was going to emerge. You want to add anything?
No. I think that's.
I guess that's my issue.
All right, so because reception is still being set up and we have a question online and I have 2 questions, perhaps we'll stay for 5 more minutes. Is that okay? Great, so I see a question online from Pallavi, and her question is to you, Jonathan, but I'm gonna piggyback on that and ask a question about that book to Michael, because I have in my notes. So what Pallavi is asking is that the second paper reminded me of Mahmoud Namdani's work, Neither Settler Nor Native. His broader argument is that ethnic identities themselves were also partly constituted by colonial governance, rather than being inherently true. Would you agree with this? This question for you, don't respond. So I'm going to piggyback on that and ask you, Michael, when you were presenting your paper, you mentioned that in the context of the Rohingyas, like we need to understand, and also the other paper that you might have written about really tracing these identities of who is indigenous and who's not. So I wonder if in the 21st century, is it really the way to go forward? Perhaps not, because it's quite dangerous to try and trace individuals and communities belonging, because belonging itself is so fragile and so fluid. Is it really sensible to trace communities' origins in terms of indigeneity? So I think it's like a broader question to you to hear your thoughts on it, because Debjani was talking about some other conference. I was going stir crazy during COVID, so I organized a bunch of workshops. So one of them had to do about with the Bengal Delta and belongingness and homelands. So in that context, this conversation came up where people were working on these kind of fluid topographies where belonging is so fragile because it's easy to be subversive, because it's hard to impose actual checkpoints and in those borderlands because there's so much water instead of land. Some comment I was making to Glenda at the beginning. So in those cases, we were thinking about the constant circulation of migration as a way of life, where it's very hard to say who is a settler and who is a native. And thereby narratives of indigeneity is actually very harmful and can be and is politicized. So that was my question to Michael, and then question from Pallavi to you, Jonathan.
Okay, not to get too confessional, this is probably one of the areas where my own thinking has moved its furthest in the sort of 15 years since my PhD. That when I started off, and this may say something about sort of late noughties, the idea that ethnic identities were largely produced by colonial governance was one that I thought was a largely plausible explanation for a lot of changes in mentalities. I don't adhere to that anymore, really. I think it is a factor, and I think it's a factor in giving particular types of content to the expressions of ethnic identity. But in the particular context of Myanmar, and one of the ways in which it may be subtly different to parts of British India, is that the state is pretty rubbish in nearly everything it does. It doesn't successfully alter people's lives on that level of detail. It's not a very effective state in many ways. It can be quite blunt. And I've been more convinced, and there's an article which has literally come out a few months ago in Comparative Studies in Society and History, that talks about the failure of reification in colonial Myanmar and after, that ethnic identifications remain somewhat fluid and messy throughout Myanmar in this period and after. I think there are other things which are shaping ethnic identity, economic niches, for instance, and patterns of migration, and those things that are as important as colonial governance, if not more important than colonial governance. And there's also increasing weight to think about the longer term threads back to the pre-colonial period, particularly around the imperatives of particular religious beliefs that structure action and structure thought as well. So I think it's a much more complicated picture now than I did in my youth when I knew so much better.
The case. Michael.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, there's a couple of things. First of all, if states produce mythologies that try to exclude people, Jewish people aren't German, for example, and historically we know that there was a Jewish population before 1873 or something like that, then as a historian you're obligated to say that's not true. You don't abide by that state myth to exclude people or to put people in the camps or something like that. That's the academic side. We can't, as historians, turn our eyes off to historical evidence or the truth, right? The other side of this is the political context of what's going on right now, and you have and I have this debate with friends who are in humanitarian things and who are activists and so on. And some of them say, well, it's much better for the world if we just go on the legal basis of citizenship. It should include everybody who's born there in that country. And we should go by international laws that Myanmar has already signed and this kind of thing. And, being involved in this other debate is counterproductive. Right. But what they don't understand about Burmese politics is that there's how the state behaves and doesn't act, and then there's how people act on the ground, which is where a lot of the atrocities actually occurred. It's from the state stepping back. It wasn't just the military that everything, it was about the state standing back and allowing a lot of villagers to do this as well, because they believed that the Rohingya were not there before 1824. So there's these two sides of that, and we can stand back and say it'd be much better if we just go by the international law and everything else, but it's like that line from Dr. Zhivago where they said, it's your point, their village. So we can stand on this, but it's they're the ones who are going to get raped and everything else. So I don't think it's a problem if something is historically accurate and you can document and you can show that actually what these people are saying is true to help people who are the underdogs in that regard. Actually, I think historians are obligated to do that. And a lot of people, the problem with Burma studies is a lot of people, in order to keep on getting access to the country, to archives and everything else, have been silent on this and don't get involved for their own personal purposes.